Hi, 18 Cinema Summary here. Today we're going to do a recap of the film The Paradise Road. This is a war drama film about the struggles of the female prisoners of the Second World War. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The film starts in a Singapore hotel during the Second World War. There's a huge party going on where soldiers are dancing with young nurses and other Britishers. Some people are also discussing the geopolitical situation of Singapore. Some are worried about the Japanese advance, while others think that the Japanese are not competent enough to beat the British forces in the region. The whole scene is that of opulence and luxury that defines the lifestyle of Westerners in Singapore. Suddenly they hear a big explosion outside, but they think that it's just the army doing some target practice. However, the celebrations are cut short when a few soldiers come on the stage and tell everyone there that the Japanese forces have broken through the British front line. The Japanese artillery pieces are in the range of the city, so it has to be cleared of any women and children belonging to the British Empire. This leads to a hasty departure of all the women and children on a boat while men are asked to stay back to help stop the invading forces. The boat leaves the harbor amidst the barrage of artillery fire, and everyone is worried about their fate. By the next morning, they are far away from Singapore, but the soldiers still ask them to wear their life jackets because they are in the range of the Japanese fighter planes. The passengers are finally starting to adapt to the lifestyle on a military ship, but that is when they see some fighter planes coming their way. The soldiers ask everyone to take shelter while they get ready for the imminent attack. They fire at the planes, but they are soon overwhelmed by the enemy fire coming their way. The ship starts to sink, and the command center is destroyed. The orders to abandon ship are given, and everyone starts jumping into the water. It's chaos everywhere, but pretty soon, everyone gets scattered across the ocean. 3 women see an island in the distance and start streaming towards it. The water is extremely cold, and they make it to the mangroves forest on the island's shore. They get through the dense mangrove and enter an open field. The women include Rosemary, a model, Susan, an Australian nurse, and Adrian, the wife of a tea planter. The women are exhausted, and they start walking on an empty road when they see some Japanese soldiers coming their way on bicycles. A Japanese army officer gives them a ride in his car and asks what they're doing in Sumatra. Adrian tells him that they are the survivors of the ship that was sunk by the Japanese army. She starts arguing with the officer, who claims that anything is fair in a state of war. He takes them down the road and drops them in an empty town. The women don't know what's happening, and they are shocked when some soldiers start hitting them and moving them into the city square. The square is filled with women from the ship, and they look terrified. A sergeant then makes the women walk in the scorching sun to a nearby prisoner camp. Some foreign women, including nuns, are already living in the camp. The women are allowed to rest for a night, but they are woken up the next morning by the soldiers who are banging on the doors. Everyone is gathered outside, where the camp commander Hirota tells them that the rule of Western people in Asia is now over. When a woman tries to ask a question, she is struck down. Everyone is also made to bow their heads for the flag-raising ceremony. From then on, the women are made to work in the fields, and they are even asked to bring water for the bathhouses. They are given raw food, and they cook and divide it among the 400-plus inhabitants of the camp. A German doctor named Verstack is also staying in the camp with all the other prisoners. She acts as the camp doctor for critically sick people. The Japanese soldiers didn't provide them with much medicine, and 4 people died in the camp. When an elderly lady becomes extremely sick with malaria, a local woman named Wing decides to buy the medicine from local smugglers. She sneaks out of the camp and meets 2 men who give her some quinine. But right then, the soldiers raise the alarm, and she has to run back to her living quarters. The next day, the camp is visited by the same officer who gave the women a lift in his car. His name is Tanaka, and he works for the military police. He gathers everyone and asks Wing to come forward. He then orders an officer to pour gasoline on her, and then he lights her on fire. The horrifying sight shakes everyone to their core as they watch Wing burn to death. They give her a funeral where a missionary woman named Daisy recites a poem about how this is the paradise road for the prisoners. After this event, the morale is very low at the camp, and pretty soon, a fight breaks out in the showers between the British woman and the Dutch ladies for a bar of soap. Then one night, Adrian is humming a classical melody, and Daisy recognizes it. She tells Adrian that she has studied music and she used to teach it in China. Adrian also studied music at the Royal Academy, and she's glad to meet a fellow musician. They both take a stroll outside the camp, and Daisy comes up with the idea for an orchestra in the camp. The women discuss this idea with other prisoners, and most of them like it. They would like to have some sort of entertainment to change the gloomy environment of the camp. Adrian starts recruiting singers for her orchestra group while Daisy writes a composition for their performance. This is when a woman named Tipler tells them that if the soldiers find the composition, everyone in the camp will be punished. This makes Susan very angry, who thinks that Tipler is working as a spy for Tanaka, and this is how she gets all the cigarettes and soap that she needs. The next morning, the women are practicing for the performance when the soldiers led by the sergeant disperse them. The sergeant even shoots the dog that belongs to an elderly lady. This act of aggression from the soldiers doesn't discourage the women, and they decide to practice in smaller groups from now on. Then one day, the sergeant comes screaming into the living quarters and hands a list to Daisy. The list includes the names of all the young women inside the camp. They are then escorted to the hotel where Japanese officers lived during the war. The Japanese interpreter tells the women that they can live in the hotel, as well if they decide to provide company to the officers living there. Adrian and the ladies of noble birth consider this offer to be extremely degrading, while some women are tempted by the idea of a better living situation. The interpreter guides the women who agreed to join a different room, while the others return to the camp. At the camp, Susan sees Verstack removing the gold dental fillings of dead women. She tells Susan that she uses these to get medicine for the camp as well as cigarettes and other necessary things. On the other hand, Susan tells her that the ladies are practicing to perform a Dvorak composition, and Verstack is impressed by it. That night when Adrian goes to the toilet, she gets ambushed by a guard, but she punches him and throws him into the mud. More guards arrive there, and Adrian is put into a makeshift prison. The next morning, Tanaka comes there and tells her that the Japanese soldiers never assault women. He says that Adrian is the one who insulted the guard and started the altercation. She tells him the truth, but Tanaka just beats her up even more. So Susan, Daisy, and a nun named Julia go to see Hirota. Hirota says that Adrian disrespected a Japanese soldier, and she will be hanged for it. Susan loses her cool at this time, and says that the officers don't provide the prisoners with any kind of medicine or food and still call them disrespectful. Julia also tries to convince Hirota, but he says that Tanaka is overseeing the matter. So Daisy says that she thought Hirota was the one controlling the camp, but she was wrong. This makes Hirota a little upset, and he decides to release Adrian, who has a couple of broken ribs, and Verstack gives her some whiskey for her pain. A couple of weeks later, it's the night of the first performance of the orchestra. The women gather outside while the sergeant asks his soldiers to stop this meeting. But as soon as the women start singing, all the soldiers stop whatever they're doing and start listening. Everyone is enjoying this performance, and even the sergeant is feeling nostalgic by the end of it. The next day, the sergeant asks all the prisoners to go back to camp, but he orders Adrian to take a walk with him into the forest. There, he asks her to sit down and start singing. He sings a Japanese song, and by the end of it, Adrian has tears in her eyes, and she says that he has a good voice. The same evening, Rosemary receives a letter from her soldier husband. He tells her that he's also in a prisoner camp. Still, he's going to escape with some fellow prisoners. He plans to escape to Australia and asks her to come to meet him in the Sydney hotel. A few days later, the prisoners observe the flag-raising ceremony when Susan makes some jokes and starts giggling. Tanaka notices this, and he asks her to come forward and tell him what she was saying. She says that she was just commenting on the hot weather, and Tanaka punishes her by making her sit in a rather uncomfortable and dangerous position. She sits like that the entire night while Verstack asks the interpreter to talk to Tanaka. She explains how Tanaka is getting involved in war crimes, and he will be hanged for it after the war. The next day, Tanaka comes there, and he goes to cut off Susan's head, but he leaves her alive and ends her punishment. Things go on like this for a while, and the ladies are now performing for the commander and his soldiers on a regular basis. Then one day, all of a sudden, the whole camp is being transported somewhere else. Adrian asks the interpreter, and he tells her that they are being taken to a different camp deep in the mountains because of all the losses that the Japanese army has faced recently. So the women are put into trucks and are taken to a railway yard. There, Rosemary sees her husband, who looks injured, and he is sitting in a Japanese army vehicle. The train starts moving, and Rosemary never gets a chance to talk to her husband. During the journey, prisoners keep dying of exhaustion. They arrive at a camp that has even worse conditions than the previous one. There isn't any food there, and the women are catching snakes and caterpillars for food. Most of them are dying because of malaria that is prevalent in the jungle. Rosemary, on the other hand, has lost all hope, and she has stopped eating. Pretty soon, she's one of the victims whose funeral is being held outside the camp. As the months go by, the camp becomes more and more empty of prisoners. Daisy has been reciting at the funeral of every single victim, but she also gets sick. She tells Adrian that she had fun performing in the orchestra with everyone. The next day, Adrian is carving a headstone for Daisy's grave. The situation doesn't get any better, and the women are now eating poisonous snails. Then all of a sudden, they are asked to gather outside, and Hirota announces that the war is over. He declares that the Japanese Empire lost, and that he tried his best to keep the woman as comfortable as possible. The soldiers start to leave the camp, and the women hug each other and cry with joy. The film ends by reminding us that all these events really happened, and the women prisoners performed numerous compositions during the Second World War. And that wraps up our recap for the movie The Paradise Road. Feel free to drop a comment below as to what we should recap next. Thank you for watching.